Hello, Year 10. Today's lesson follows on from yesterday's. So, yesterday we're thinking about the impact of the purges, Stalin's attempt to increase his control of the Soviet Union. Today we're going to think about one example of the purges. We're going to think about the gulags, them labour camps that were set up. If you weren't executed, there's a good chance you were sent to a gulag in the Soviet Union. So, our objective is to understand the living conditions that many Soviet citizens were forced to endure in the 1930s. To get our brains going, what I'd like to think about to begin with is this question just here. What do you think Soviet citizens thought about the gulags according to these sources? So how would they have thought, how would they have felt about the gulags if we were to look at this propaganda poster on the left, there's a story of Ivan Buryov in the middle here, and a secondary source on the right trying to give some idea to you about why people might have been sent to the gulags. So as usual, can you pause the video just now, have a think about the question, answer it in the Microsoft assignment, and come back when you are ready. Okay, so some of the ideas you might have thought were that Soviet citizens probably feared doing anything wrong, however minor, because as you can see, people being sent to the Gulag for anything. Maybe citizens felt helpless. They literally had no control over what happened to them because they could be accused of the very smallest of crimes. But maybe also it meant citizens wanted to challenge their government even though they knew they couldn't and it was so dangerous. So in a way, Stalin's methods about consolidating his power were also actually increasing resentment against him. Now, I thought you might be interested to know before we move on what this propaganda poster says here because it is quite intimidating. It says, "Look me in the eyes and tell me honestly, who is your friend? Who is your enemy? You have no friends among capitalists. You have no enemies among the workers. Only in a union of the workers of all nations will you be victorious over capitalism and liberated from exploitation." Now, it goes on a little bit there, but there's two key ideas that's coming out from that propaganda poster that help us understand the purges. First is that it was trying to appeal to people about the importance of this communist project that Stalin was trying to build, this economic miracle he was trying to achieve. But also, it talks about the workers of all nations. And we know from yesterday's lesson that Stalin was arresting and targeting people who represented either national independence or ethnic identities. So, for example, the Poles or the Germans or the Ukrainians, people who'd historically been independent from the Soviet Union and might want that independence again in the future. Okay, what do I need to do in this lesson? Well, you've already completed the starter activity. If you haven't, make sure you have something written in. Now, I'd like you to think about whether you're going to do option A or option B. So if you just answer the question in section 1, it will send you directly to option A or option B, and then watching your specific learning video, complete the questions, all about what was life like in the Gulag. Once you've done that, I'd like you to add one final contribution, and that is, can you give something to our Microsoft Teams Museum exhibition? I'd like you to add one image with a sentence or two to explain it into the chat page. And the theme of our museum is Memories of the Gulags, which can help teach us an important lesson about life in 2020. So you'll have to have a look through a range of different sources and pick something that you think means something to you about what life was like in the gulags, but also can you explain how this might help us understand the world today? Now, if you're really interested in trying to understand what is it like in a labour camp, very sadly, these still exist in North Korea. And there's a very famous film that you can watch called Camp 14 that's on YouTube, and I'll show you how you can see that. You can watch it in full length, and although it's not in a Soviet camp from the 30s, it does give you some idea of the fear, of the structure, and of the punishments that were used to keep people in their place. Some keywords for today's lesson include purge. We've said it quite a few times already, to get rid of the elements that you don't want from something, like Stalin's political opponents. Terror, the idea of trying to spread fear across the population so they'll do what you want. A gulag is a labour camp where those who had been arrested were sent to in order to go and work, but often with very little food and poor conditions that led to millions of deaths. A kulak was a rich farmer. They were often sent to the gulags in the early 1930s. Political prisoners, people who simply had different political opinions, could also be sent to the gulags. The NKVD, we know they were the secret police, but they were also responsible for running the gulags. And lastly, a new word, you're going to come across this in one or two of the sources, a goner. A goner is what a very, very emaciated, which means someone who's very underweight and malnourished, someone basically who didn't have enough food was referred to as a goner in the Gulag, because the idea was that sadly they weren't going to live for too much longer. So for the third task, the reflection, you can come back to this website here in order to find some good primary sources about life in the Gulag. You can have a look at other ones as well, but remember you're going to need one image and a sentence or two to explain what that is and what can it teach us about life in 2020 as well as life in the past. And lastly, if you're interested in learning a bit more about conditions in a labour camp, you could even Google Earth this right now, and that's something we could discuss in the lesson. But there's a YouTube link here to Camp 14, a really, really interesting and true documentary about life in a North Korean labour camp. It's got bits that are animated as well as bits involving direct interviews, and it makes it very, very watchable and very, very interesting. So there you are. I'll be available during the lesson if you've got any questions, but otherwise I hope you enjoyed learning about the very sad reality of what life was like for many Soviet citizens in a gulag in the 1930s.